Okay,
Thanks.
that
Hello,
would be
everyone.
wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was invited into this session because of a story that I told to Cornelia apparently last year. I've had quite a varied background globally and live in the eco-village Findhorn now for 8 years. And so I have, in my own work, been called to look at how we develop individuals and then leaders and then teams and then organizations and then sectors and then communities and then cities. So usually I'm working with a framework of something I've developed called Integral City, thinking about human habitations as complex, adaptive, living systems. And of course, when you look at them that way, and especially if you take a holistic, integral perspective, they include all those smaller fractals, the individuals, the leaders, the teams, the organizations, and the sectors and communities. And they're like a fractal. They all have similar patterns of growing. Many of you are probably familiar with the terminology that's often used about organizations or teams, that they must form, storm, norm, and then perform. And that is a cycle that tends to grow iteratively and sometimes back and forth between those stages of form, storm, norm, and perform. So some years ago, maybe many of you probably know of the writer, philosopher, psychiatrist who wrote the book A Road Less Traveled, Scott Peck. And Scott Peck had a very interesting background that I think has lots of overlap with Eco-Village Findhorn. He was raised as a Quaker, and then he became a psychiatrist, and he was sent by the American military to Japan, where he encountered Buddhism. And then when he came back to the States in the early 50s, I think it was, he then became aware of the Tavistock principles that had been developed here in England around how to sit in a circle and really listen to people. Out of this work, he developed a process that a lot of us would recognize as collective dialogue or circle work or anything that has to do with developing community. And he developed an organization called the Foundation for Community Encouragement. And these days, as I've been in the hall, I can see you've had little pictures, and I can see where I was a few minutes ago. There's on the very end of the right side of the picture where the Universal Hall is, where those tables are. I have a table very populated with the work that's come out of thinking about community and recognizing the patterns in communities and organizations. So I ended up working with many of the facilitators for the Foundation for Community Encouragement's work for holding dialogue. And the work was really profound. I don't know if any of you encountered that or participated in it, but the facilitation is very subtle. So you would be taught to do this with 2 or 3 other people. And before the circle or dialogue was held, the first thing you had to do was develop community with the people that you were working with. So as people acquired these skills, when I look back on it now, I can see that they were developing over time themselves greater and greater capacity to hold the field of community. That's what I would call it now, an energetic field. But they also started to develop these capacities, not just in one place, like I think it was started in the United States, in the Northeast states, Connecticut, Maine, but it spread all across the states. And where I encountered it first was in Canada. And I had, like many people, read the book, The Road Less Traveled, and so was really impacted by this worldview. And I was really enthusiastic about working with the facilitators. And I was quite shocked, if not surprised, to find that the facilitators and the organization itself was encountering a great deal of difficulty. And they were realizing that this view that they had of the world, that it was possible to develop community, to encourage community, to give people the skills to hold dialogue circles in their own communities, was not an easy calling. And they found when they were in individual communities who invited them in, the work might be very challenging, but quite doable. But they then started to offer their facilitation, their workshops to more public gatherings. And this was much more difficult because they found that there would be a range of people, not all of whom were motivated to be there for the same reasons. And some were even there to see if they could maybe make things more difficult than the facilitators anticipated or planned. So eventually, over time, the board that had formed for the Foundation for Community Encouragement came to the conclusion that they could no longer be consider themselves successful. So by this time, they had really developed quite a long following, a wide following, and there was a great deal of grief in the community of the organization about the prospects that the organization would actually cease operation. So in their wisdom, the facilitators decided that what they would do is they would have a wake for the organization. And so instead of just closing it down, they would end the organization with a recognition of all of the value that people had brought and all of the value that they had contributed to the world. So they set a date and they sent out invitations, and it was actually in the Forest Wake University that we attended this wake that was held for about 3 days. It wasn't a trivial small event, but a fully developed workshop that really recognized the tremendous amount of value that had been created and contributed. And as we went through the process, we were really given the opportunity in community to grieve what we were losing. And so it was, as you might imagine, because this organization had existed for quite some time, there were people who had worked together in various combinations as facilitators, people who had come to know various communities who had done multiple workshops over time. And they were familiar with one another, that they not only could be vulnerable to the grief they were experiencing, but there was also laughter. Remember when, and sharing stories, and really having the opportunity not to just read about something in a newsletter or a letter or something that was impersonal, but to be together through this really difficult time. And what it taught me, who had, I thought, a fairly extensive experience of organizational life, both, in global size organizations and regional and more local, that this was really a profound experience. And as I've been able to look back, I realized that this organizational pattern that we were experiencing gave us some insight that we knew and know that for a grieving process to happen on an individual basis, that it has its own time and it has its own cycle. And so do organizations. And so because this was designed by the people who were letting it go, so it included all the board members, it included all the facilitators, it included many people who had just simply attended the workshops. They included hosts, it included donors. So the whole system was brought into the room. And if you can imagine, one of the things I learned about circle work when I first worked with the Foundation for Community Encouragement is that a circle should not be much more than 40 people in the circle, because otherwise it's hard to see across the circle and you can't relate to people. But there were so many people in the room that we not only had a 40-person inner circle, but we had outer circle that I think, if my memory serves me, probably had 60 to 100 people in it. So I think we had 150 to 200 people at that weekend for the wake of the Foundation for Community Encouragement. So I'm telling you this story because what it inspired in Cornelia to see was that organizations have life cycles, just like people have life cycles. And organizationally, some of the work that has influenced me comes through somebody by the name of Dr. Ichak Adizes, and he has written a book that's well known called Corporate Life Cycles. And he recognizes that organizations come into being and they're just like, babies and young children full of energy, but not much discipline. And as they gradually age, they become like teenagers and then mature adults, and then they have a peak. And they too can also then become elders. And if they are not renewed, then they too will probably end in some way like the Foundation for Community Encouragement. But this cycle of thinking about organizations, of having a life cycle like individuals, helps us to really appreciate that we must experience and hold them in different ways and interact with them in different ways. So we have in the next session in the Universal Hall a recognition and some, we're going to have a fishbowl set of conversations sitting in circle with people who have begun their organization, who are in transition in their organization, and who are either have experienced an ending or are in the process of ending. So those are the stories and the framing that I wanted to give Sue today to this session online, and just invite us to maybe share some stories about, have you had the experience of beginning with an organization, and what's that feel like? And are you in transition, or are you also maybe now going through an experience of ending an organization? So Sue, do you think it's, with the number of people here, I think we might just have a plenary discussion about this. Would that work for you?
Yeah, I think so. Does anybody have an immediate story or question? I mean, I can share a story. Oh, Helena, you go for it. Thanks.
So I'll do it later.
Just before you do, I just want to thank you, Marilyn. That was really
thank you.
very interesting. But you go ahead, Helena. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I could not listen in you without thinking immediately in the Findorn Foundation. As you were talking, I was going along my experience with the Findorn Foundation, and I was seeing these old men dying, and that touched me deeply, because somehow we still had the hope that it didn't die, but it did. And that takes lots of space for grief.
Yeah.
To honor all the things that have been done and all the things that thousands, maybe millions of people have learned with it, which was fantastic. But I have a story which is also connected with my life. Once I got pregnant the first time, I was 26. And as soon as my boy born, I understand I could not work in the normal 9-to-5 work. And I decided to build up a school. So my school, born with my children, with my child, and because then came the second, and as they grew, I could understand that my business was growing like the boys. At the beginning, it was like a child, and then an infant, and then a teenager. And then when the pandemics come, they were already like 19 and 13, and I said to myself, it's over. It's over, because I had done that school because I wanted to raise them. And so I took the chance to raise hundreds of other kids. But in the beginning, when I need to end my school, I couldn't deal with this, that you said, the grief, the process of ending what it was already over.
Yes. Yes.
And now you put in words what 5 years ago I couldn't see. And it is so important to honor what we received in life, we have in life, as it is important to allow it to end. Because when it ends, normally it has already ended a little bit earlier. And I am very thankful and grateful to what the awareness you have brought to this talk, because it shows me exactly how to honor, but at the same time move on to the
Yes.
next step.
Yeah. Thank you, Helena. That's very wise, and I love your observation and reframing. And I might just go back to your comment about Fintorn Foundation. Yes, it is going through endings, and in fact, though, the older foundation, the trust, created a new organization 2 years ago that we called the SCIO, the Scottish Charitable Institution, and so that's actually, we have two ages of organizations going here, and both of them have influenced the community. So if we thought of an organization as like a tree, in fact, this tree has had so many seeds in the community, there's a whole ecosystem of life here. And so the ecosystem includes impacts on individuals. There's many organizations. This whole Enterprise Day is celebrating the organizations, and they're at different stages of life. But I love your story about the school and being able to relate it to the ages of your children and the many other children that you influence, because you're actually seeing more than a metaphor. You're seeing the two fractals of the organization that is actually supporting their learning in life. And you must also look at yourself that way too, because if you were the founder, you yourself have lived through the founder working with a new child organization, and then having to go through the middle stages, and then coming to a recognition that this time is over, and to celebrate it, as opposed to end it without allowing both the grief and the celebration to sort of weave themselves together to make a whole that actually is a legacy. It's a legacy for what wants to come next, I think. And one of the things that we know about trauma healing is that if we think about grief as being in the trauma field, that once we can heal that, we release so much energy into the world and into life. We have more energy to start new beginnings. Yeah. So those are just some of the things, my reflections. Thank you so much for that story. Does anybody else have a story they'd like to share about transitions or beginnings or endings?
I can, unless somebody else wants to share, I can share a story. Around 2015, I think, in Portugal, we set up an organisation called Reeconomia, which I've shared a little bit about earlier in the day. And we were so enthusiastic, and it evolved out of a transition movement who was having some difficulty, cultural difficulties, because many of the English people were trying to lead it, and it could have been more more sensibly if we'd have left it to the Portuguese to go through whatever transition that needed to go through and then lead that process. But we took it upon ourselves to set up another organisation, rather like something that had happened in Devon, which was called Reconomia, because we were interested in involving the local businesses in supporting the local community. And so we set up an alternative currency, and we started to swap services, and it was called TAVS after the town of Tavira. And this went on for a couple of years. And we used to get together and we'd go down into the town and we'd have a stall down there, and we'd get people signing up for various things around campaigns to do with making sure we got water fountains in the town instead of plastic bottles. And we'd swap things, swap seeds. We were doing so much, and then COVID hit. And we kind of went into backwards, and we weren't trading anymore, and a few of us ran out of steam. And but there is still an exchange group, a troca. How do you say it in Portuguese, Helena?
Troca.
Troca, which means exchange. But we haven't really got involved with it. And there's part of me that is grieving this. And yet there's another part of me that hasn't got the energy to carry on. And I'm thinking, what's next? So I'm grateful for you, for what you were saying around recognizing times to move on. But at the same time, I'm hankering for that community, hankering for that connection. And I'm getting it today because we're all here and I'm seeing things. And I'm seeing, I still meet people. I met someone that was involved in it last night, and I'm going to buy her carnations and some of her organic produce. And I'm also a grower, so I give a lot of my produce away. But it's looking again at that transition, at that, what do you call it? You didn't call it an organisational life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't think of it as being a life cycle. I thought it was just something that we did. And it was quite complicated because some of us who set it up had to set up a charity.
Yes.
And the complications in Portugal of setting up anything is difficult, but a charity is even more. But we managed to get 10 willing people, and we met constantly, and talked a lot. And we also met at an organic farm regularly, like every couple of weeks, and that's gone. So what's next, I'm asking myself. And how do you see these things, or do you see these things evolving into something else? I just thought I'd share that story, and maybe you have any thoughts on it.
Yeah, those are interesting examples too, Sue, because especially when you're basing your organization on something else that's living, it necessarily will have a life cycle. And you probably have to adapt that organization to its seasonal flows. And so I think an expression that I often appreciate about situations or organizations is, it's had its season. And that means that it's come to a natural conclusion. It's had its autumn and it's moving into its fall. And what we know about natural cycles is the autumn is very potent. Everything goes below ground and it seems like it's dark. But all that is happening below ground is that it's reforming so that it can emerge in the next spring season. So I think if we use those kinds of intelligences of nature, they can help us to, I think, relate in positive ways, even in circumstances that feel like we're losing something. Maybe it's not a loss, but it's a transmutation, a reframing, an opportunity that we have to take a pause. So I think that's one of the things about life cycles that reminds us too, is that humans are often wanting to just like push forward, only direction is forward, forward, forward. And we don't think about the tides that ebb and flow, or the seasons that have built in these periods of time when taking a pause, even for a whole season, like an autumn as it might look, that are actually required in order for the next season to naturally come along. I think also it's helpful to stand back and see if something has had its season, maybe even the ground has to be allowed to go fallow. So maybe you need a longer pause in what you have completed to before you start something new. I think that a lot of our, especially Western societies, have lost the community grace of grieving. So it's not so much prevalent that we have, except in some faith systems that I've participated in, that we honor lives through memorials that look back and reappreciate the gifts that have come out of that organization or that group of people. I know the same thing can happen with projects. The nice thing, the difference between projects and organizations is projects generally have a life cycle. They have an end. They're anticipated. We start, we do the work, we finish, and there's an end. Whereas organizations have a much longer extended period, and there may not be this final end. So when it comes to the point where you recognize that circumstances have created the conditions for the natural ending of the organization, to do it gracefully so that it is a regenerative process instead of something that is simply linear and cutting off without recognizing that there are all kinds of opportunities and legacies that have been created in the process of the life of that life. I think I would just say, since so many people are here because of Findhorn, that I don't think it's unnatural at all to say that organizations have a spirit. We often will draw angels for organizations, that they're beings in and of themselves. So to honor them as such is also to, I think, invite in the support from other realms as we go through these life cycles.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder. That's really important. We're not doing this alone. We're not doing any of this alone. Yeah. Good. I've just noticed that Rebecca Lynn's come in from Cape Breton, and you may have missed some of what Marilyn had to say. Are you there, Rebecca Lynn? No. Maybe she can't hear us.
Maybe she can, and I see Cape Breton, so I'm actually Canadian.
Oh, are you?
So it reminds me another story of endings. Excuse me for a second. So yeah, this is a story about Newfoundland. So I was told this story while it was still partly going on, and it would be going back to early 2000s, let's say. And so Newfoundland had a public health system where it had hospitals in all the little villages. And this is not uncommon, I think, around the world to have had our bureaucracies say at some point in time, well, we can't really afford to support those hospitals, so we're going to make them regional hospitals. So we're just going to close down all those smaller hospitals in villages. And of course, that's a great shock to people who depend on them, because hospitals are no doubt a significant part of the healthcare of our communities. So the bureaucracy in Newfoundland had a certain amount of wisdom, and they invited in a Catholic sister. And I think they made her a minister of something to do with health in the provincial government. And they said, "Sister, what we'd like you to do is to close down all of those small hospitals." And and of course she was both shocked but wise enough to say, okay, I'm willing to take on this task, but what I ask from you is that every closing that we do, the building and organization has a wake. A lot of Newfoundland is influenced from Irish history and Irish ancestry, so having a wake is a really traditional thing to do. And of course, if that was the condition in order to do this very difficult work, because I think there were hundreds that had to be dealt with. So she, I think it was Sister Elizabeth. So Sister Elizabeth set off to do her work, and she made sure that the wake was created by all the staff in administration and even the people who had been served by the hospital as patients came together and really celebrated it and had a proper wake for each of the buildings and institutions until they got to sort of the end when everyone was sort of like saying, well, sister, I don't think we need to really have a wake for this place. And she would say, just a minute. Every place has its own culture. Every place needs to be honored and celebrated. And I will not have a wake for this last place. And so indeed, they did have it, and it made all the difference because people were able to reconcile the loss to the community, but at the same time, release and discover new energies. But I just thought this was such a wonderful way to actually have the bureaucracy enable something that is culturally extremely important, but not something they would necessarily have on their task list when they thought, we'll save a lot of money by closing these. But in order to do that, we have to actually embrace the whole of all of these individual communities. So there you go. There's another little story. And I don't know if we got the lady from Cape Breton in, but she probably would have recognized it because Cape Breton is not very far away from Newfoundland.
No, she seems to have gone, but I'm sure she'll be back. Yeah. Thank you so much, Marilyn, for this information that you've shared this afternoon. It's made me think, and I'll go away and reflect a little bit more around perhaps having a wake. Organising a wake for Reeconomia, that would be getting
Yes.
people together to have the wake. That would be fun.
Well, when I first came here and I saw that many of the old bungalows had been actually earmarked for a new life, they were going to be removed and new accommodations were going to be built. And so I told somebody this story, and they said, maybe Marilyn, you could organize a wake for each of the bungalows. And I said, well, I think each of the bungalows would have stories to tell that ought to be honored in a wake. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just check what time it is. We're supposed to go into, well, no, roving reporters are supposed to come on now. So we're waiting for Dorota to come back, I believe. And is there would anybody else like to ask Marilyn a question or share one of their stories before we thank her again? No?
You might have stories that aren't just related to endings, because oftentimes we're not around for an ending, but transitions are usually where most of the organizations that we relate with are in. So can you think of organizations that would be at the equivalent age of say a teenager or a young adult, and they're going through maybe an adjustment stage? I think a number of you noted in your stories the impact that COVID had, the lockdowns had. So some organizations were able to be more resilient than others. And maybe you have a story about some organization that survived because they were able to go through that transition.
And there must have been a huge, oh, okay. there must have been a huge impact upon the community in terms of what COVID did. You know, just for the enterprises there and what people are offering, not being able to communicate. So that in itself, along with all the other things that have gone on, yeah, the transition, isn't it? Thank you. Thank you so much, Marilyn. I'm looking forward to seeing you again, possibly in the main hall.
Yes, I think that is my next calling. I think that I am supposed to move on and participate over in the big hall. So
Okay, well, thank you for coming in to see us. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
you're most welcome, and I've enjoyed talking with you, Helena, and I hope that those of you who are listening found the stories valuable, and thank you for sharing, Sue, also your stories. And hi, Dorota. I'll connect with you in another part of this wonderful enterprise for enterprises.